So, I started my week believing that this would be a fairly straightforward news episode, mostly focused on elements related to Disneyland's 70th. I'm typing this right now in my hotel room on July 17th, the day that Disneyland turned 70. As the week started, I thought the big reveal would almost surely be the presentation of the Walt animatronic, a figure that would again touch on an ongoing dispute between the Disney company and one of Walt's granddaughters, Joanna. To some extent, that was true, only not in the way that I had anticipated. Let me back up here for a moment. Last August, the Disney company announced that they were planning to finish and present an animatronic of Walt as part of the resort's 70th birthday season, a project that had been in discussions in some form since 2018. But as it was announced at the D23 event, there was no one from Walt's side of the family to give it their blessing. Instead, the company invited Roy P. Disney, who is the grandson of Walt's brother Roy O. Disney. And this right here suggested that there might be some issues on the Walt side of the family about this animatronic. Shortly after the public announcement, one of Walt's granddaughters, Joanna Miller, publicly came out against the figure, starting an online campaign to shelve this animatronic. "I would appreciate support to convince the company to abandon the robot of Grandpa," she wrote on social media. "Please, if you feel the same, perhaps write letters." As work continued on the animatronic through the fall at the Disney company, Joanna of the Disney family added to her argument by pointing out what she believed were Walt's wishes on the matter. Well, most importantly, she added, "I learned that Grandpa told Sam McKim that he never wanted to be an animatronic." Sam McKim was one of Walt's core Imagineers. Joanna suggested that Walt's likeness on film from all of those TV introductions and other presentations was a more appropriate way to keep Walt's legacy alive. But inside the company, some felt that the technology that Walt helped pioneer would be a stronger way to present his life and identity to new generations, which was an unusual project for the modern-day Disney company. Essentially to create an expensive attraction without thrills, breathtaking special effects, or even the inclusion of movie-related IP. It's been years since Disney opened a new attraction without a strong connection to movie-related situations or characters. So this tells me that likely some in the company with the best intentions were fighting for this outlier attraction, an animatronic show of Walt, because they felt a kinship with Walt's ideas, his characters, and his legacy. And here is where we get down into the weeds of all of this in terms of the overt power structure. From a legal standpoint, the Disney company absolutely had the right to produce the show. From 1966, that is the time of Walt's death, up through 1981, the Disney company paid the Disney family a sizable yearly royalty to use Walt's name and likeness, which were technically held by Retlaw, a private company managed by Walt's family. But in 1981, the Disney company made an offer of about $46 million to purchase assets from Retlaw, which would then be transferred over and controlled by the company. These assets included Walt's name and likeness, also some attractions that Walt personally owned at the park, which included the monorail and the narrow-gauge steam locomotives. This sale would consolidate most of the remaining assets related to the professional life of Walt under the Disney company, instead of having them split between the company and the family. And in these assets was the right to use the likeness of Walt in a way the company believed was appropriate. Now fast forward about 44 years. This meant that the Disney company, from a legal standpoint, didn't need Walt's heirs to sign off on an animatronic of Walt's likeness. But on the flip side, the optics of all of this were terrible for the company. To have one of Walt's own grandkids, one of the grandkids who had firm personal memories of Walt, come out against this project. Now add in one more complication. Disney needed some significant attraction or experience to anchor the 70th celebration in Anaheim, something around which it could build a marketing and PR campaign. And because ex-CEO Bob Chapek had diverted resort profits away from attraction development from 2020 through the end of 2022, mostly to backfill losses in the new Disney Plus streamer, Disney had very little else in the pipeline that could be swapped into this spot to highlight the 70th anniversary. And so the Walt animatronic went forward. The company was able to get some mild support from two of Walt's other grandkids, but I wouldn't say that their statements were exactly glowing. Late in 2024, Disney announced that the Walt animatronic would open on May 16, 2025. This date was later bumped back to July 17, 2025. And to be honest, a week ago, I thought that we were likely going to have a discussion today about the exhibit and the presentation, and we will get to that, at least the presentation part, mostly focused on how or if the Walt animatronic, assuming it was a strong presentation, might change the mind of some of Walt's family and also those fans who were against turning Walt into an animatronic. But on the flip side here, for most of this year, I could see that there were some clear, if small, issues ahead for this project. To be specific, Imagineering tends to use movement in animatronics to express broad gestures or emotions. Just think of Rise of the Resistance. The Kylo Ren animatronic is often throwing up his hands or turning quickly in easily readable, large displays of intent and emotion. This is also true of the historical animatronics in stage presentations such as the American Adventure at Epcot. Ben Franklin and Mark Twain are far more expressive with their arms and upper body movements than are most people. In terms of entertainment, this is what modern animatronics are particularly good at. Slightly exaggerated motion that is easy to read for an audience at a distance, even if the figure on stage doesn't always appear realistic. That's generally what I thought we were going to be talking about today. Did the company find a way to dial down animatronic movement to create a nuanced and realistic presentation of a recent historical figure who many remember from TV? Walt himself, when presenting, wasn't always the most demonstrative with his body and arms. But that's not exactly how this story turned out. Between the announcement and opening, there were a couple of surprises along the way, and in retrospect, maybe the announcement that the animatronic was being shifted from May 16th to July 17th should have been a sign that not all was entirely right with the sophisticated stage show that Disney wanted to debut for Disneyland 70th. And that right there is what we're going to get into on today's episode. In our story today, there are clearly two sides, and I want to set up both of these before we get down into the details of the new show, which is called Walt Disney: A Magical Life. For much of his life, Walt Disney was a public figure, and therefore presumably comfortable before the public, including offering the public various representation of his likeness and image. I think most people have seen clips of Walt introducing his weekly show. He introduced that show from 1954 until his passing in 1966. He even pre-filmed some of those intros so that the last new intro to his weekly show appeared in April 1967, about 4 months after his death, for an episode called A Salute to Alaska. These intros largely are how the public knew Walt Disney during his later years. And let me point out a couple of things. In these introductions, Walt primarily communicates with facial expressions and voice. If you go back and watch those intros, you'll see that Walt's body is relatively subdued. The primary point of visual communication are his eyes, eyebrows, and the muscles around his mouth. He also tends to tilt and swivel his head a little bit. Sometimes directors would give him props, such as a wooden pointer or an oversized book, which encouraged a little more movement, But demonstrative movement wasn't primarily how he communicated intent, engagement, and interest. In his later years, he was a little bit better at moving his hands or pointing to provide more visual interest for the small screen. I'm guessing that this was something he practiced. Still, his primary area of focus was in his face and small movements with his head. In my opinion, Walt's main strength was communicating warmth, enthusiasm, and a muted optimism through his voice and through his eyes, which were often only 3/4 open, as though he were slightly squinting at something fascinating before him. So hang on to that info for a bit, it will be important later. But beyond the famous intros on his TV show, Walt repeatedly showed up both as himself or as a drawn caricature in his own films. Walt's first film to be accepted for national distribution, the short film Alice's Wonderland, includes a young Walt Disney sitting at his desk, who then shows Alice, played by the 4-year-old Virginia Davis, how his animation studio works, as all the drawings then come to life. Animators occasionally caricatured Walt and slipped those images into animated shorts. Walt's image, for example, inspired the matador in the 1938 Disney cartoon Ferdinand the Bull. Yensid, the sorcerer in the Sorcerer's Apprentice section of Fantasia, was also inspired by Walt, particularly the sorcerer's facial expressions when upset. Like Walt, that sorcerer, Yensid, primarily communicated emotion through his eyes, eyebrows, and small and subtle turns of his mouth. And let me add in a little more detail here. For animators in 1940, which was the year when Fantasia was released, closely observed facial expressions to communicate nuanced emotion was a struggle. If you review the history of Disney animation, you'll find that the early cartoons have very, very few facial close-ups. The wonder of early Disney cartoons was largely based on choreographed movement and pratfall humor. These are elements that, when laid out for a cartoon, benefit from full-body presentation. Typically in early Disney cartoons, Mickey Mouse is presented on screen as a full figure, from the top of his ears to the bottom of his tail, often beside other full-figure characters. If you're going to have musical elements, even if it's just a lightly choreographed walk cycle, it's more visually satisfying to show the entire body. But at the same time that animation was focused on musical presentations and sight gags, that is, the 1930s, live action got some new technology, specifically long lenses that allowed cinematographers to focus in on the face of actors while gently blurring the background. In photography, we might call this bokeh now, an aesthetic quality where the subject is in sharp focus while the background is softened or slightly blurred. Live action directors from this era were teaching their audience to focus on the face as the primary place of emotional communication in film, while animation directors were teaching their audience to focus on the body as the primary place of communication. When Disney wanted to move from shorts to features, he realized that his animation would need to mimic the visual grammar of recently produced live-action films. Audiences were emotionally attached to live-action characters on screen because the camera, with those longer, shallow-focus lenses, brought the audience into an intimate space with the actors. Disney tried to imitate this in his feature-length works, to find ways to bring the audience into that same space with animated characters, only this was a struggle. After a decade or so of primarily animating the body, many Disney artists struggled to enter the artistic space where they could also animate the face, particularly the human face, with a nuanced sense of realism. Among the few people to do this well was animator Bill Teitla. If you look over the first 3 Disney features, Teitla animates 3 of the characters that are exceptional at conveying emotion through nuanced facial expression. These characters are Grumpy, Stromboli, and Yensid the Sorcerer. The leads in these same films, such as Snow White and Pinocchio, leaned far more heavily into bodily expression or voice to convey their feelings. Among the second wave of Disney artists, the one who, in my opinion, best demonstrated this skill, the ability to express complex emotions and motivation through subtle facial movements, was Milt Kahl. Just go back and look at pretty much any scene of Madame Medusa in The Rescuers. Again, hang on to this information, we're going to loop back to it. But to get back to our list of places where Walt or an image based on Walt appeared in film, the next big one is The Reluctant Dragon. In 1941, Walt appeared as himself in The Reluctant Dragon. This film mixed sections of a live-action tour of the newly finished Disney studio in Burbank with sections of animation. The following year, Walt again appeared as himself in Saludos Amigos, specifically in the live-action sections that focused on the Disney tour of Latin America. As a voice actor, Walt was most notably the first voice of Mickey Mouse. He also voiced some other characters in the studio's early days. To cap this off, he regularly appeared on the Mickey Mouse Club in the 1950s. So these elements together suggest, at least to me, that during Walt's lifetime, he was comfortable appearing as himself both in filmed presentations and in presentations that artistically adapted his appearance or voice into caricatures or other appearances. Now let's add in one more element. Walt used animatronic technology to present lifelike presentations of historical figures, most notably Abraham Lincoln. At least in Walt's lifetime, I'd say that most of the human AA figures were more of a proof of concept than they were fully realized moving presentations of the human form, but all that was coming. So at least in Walt's purview, he was comfortable using the tools of mechanics and sculpture to create believable dimensional presentations of important historical figures. And again, these areas together suggest, at least to me, that Walt was comfortable using the artistic and engineering skills of his staff to represent real people, which at times, at least in terms of drawings, included himself. Now, on the other side, I'm also sensitive to a list of concerns primarily raised by Walt's granddaughter, Joanna, who knew Walt as her grandfather for over a decade until he passed. In her post on social media, it seems clear that she didn't want her own memories of Walt muddied by what she termed a robotic reimagining of her grandfather. And to me, this also seems reasonable. At a different time in the company's history, such as when it might have had other significant projects for the parks further down the pipeline, the best thing to do might have been to shelve this particular project until those family members that remembered Walt personally had passed, thereby respecting their personal memories. When Walt himself made that Lincoln animatronic, Lincoln had no family members left that had personal memories of him. But that's not the path that the Disney company went down. In part, I think a chunk of this is due to the complete mess left by Bob Chapek in terms of funding projects for the park. And in terms of moving forward with this project, the other path would be to create an extremely high-quality presentation that hopefully would overcome the objections of family members to having Walt presented in animatronic form. And at this point, after the public dispute over the animatronic figure, it seems that the Disney company was making gestures to make peace with Joanna and any other grandkids who objected to the project. One of the first ways of doing this was to partner with the Walt Disney Family Museum to co-create the new display in the two rooms that lead to the Opera House Theater. The Walt Disney Family Museum is overseen by the Walt Disney Family Foundation. The museum worked with the Disney company to bring more of Walt's personal life into the Opera House gallery rooms, including the actual furniture from Walt's Main Street apartment. Next, in a private ceremony on July 13th, Disney unveiled a new tribute window to Lillian on what would have been Walt and Lillian's 100th wedding anniversary. This was also exactly 70 years after Walt and Lillian held their own 30th wedding anniversary party inside of an almost finished Disneyland on the evening of July 13, 1955. Walt called this the Tempest Fugit Party. In other words, time flies. He invited a couple hundred guests to join him at the park amidst the final construction. There were still structures in the park that needed paint and walkways that needed to be paved, but most of Frontierland was finished, so the main gathering for that anniversary took place inside the Golden Horseshoe Saloon. Lillian's window on Main Street was unveiled on the anniversary of that party. In terms of the window itself, it presents Lillian's life through her interests. As Lillian kept a rather ornate flower garden at Disney's Holmby Hills estate, her tribute window is arranged as the sign for a fictitious florist shop. Lillian's Bountiful Blooms, it says, flowers and fancies. Just beneath the window itself on the upper floor balcony is a wrought iron chair with a Mickey figure seated in it, a nod to Lillian helping name the character. And yes, I'm aware that there are multiple stories about the invention of Mickey Mouse's name. And there is also a painting of Walt's apartment, which is just across Town Square. The window is also directly across the way from the Main Street Opera House, where the Walt Disney animatronic was set to appear 4 days after Lillian's window was revealed. And beyond this, also as a temporary nod to Walt and Lillian's 100th anniversary, Disney set up a display inside the Golden Horseshoe Saloon right at the front by the stage. The display included a 4-tiered wedding cake capped with lace and bells, along with an invitation, or at least a replica of the invitation, to the Tempest Fugit Party, and an image of Walt 70 years ago cutting into that cake. The cake for this display is positioned on a small circular table right where it would have stood on that night back in July 1955. There's also a photo of Walt and Lillian standing next to the yellow Main Street Surrey that Walt used to drive inside the park. I'm guessing that the Walt Disney Family Museum had a hand in this too, but I don't know that. The display, as I mentioned, was temporary. I think the cake, or at least the icing, was real and was set to be removed at the end of the day on Saturday, July 19th. But this, too, was another goodwill gesture to reconnect the family with the company. And so at this point, things were going pretty well, despite the controversy. But then there was one tremendous misstep. Here's where things went wrong. On the morning of July 14th, that is right after Lillian's window was unveiled to the public, Disney invited a small group of people to an early preview of the Walt Disney animatronic presentation. Among them, notable bloggers and reporters, many of whom had cameras, including some with low-light telephoto lenses. And then these photos were posted online. I will say right here that when viewed through a telephoto lens as a close-up as opposed to simply viewing the animatronic from inside the theater, the face of the Walt animatronic does look off-model. Photographers, particularly with sophisticated cameras, can also dial up the ISO to increase the light so that far more is revealed of the figure than one, using just their eyes, would see in person with just the theatrical lighting. But clearly, and I don't mean to dismiss this, there are some things in the figure, particularly the face, which are off, and which are far more noticeable in photos than in person. The chin is too rounded, the forehead too wide, the area around Walt's eyes too pronounced, his eyebrows are a little too bushy. From just seeing these images, I can't really tell you where things went slightly wrong. The sculpt, the claying, perhaps the need for additional electronics beneath the skin to improve the movement range of the figure's face, which broadened out its appearance. I don't really know. But any of these things might account for the additional heaviness in his face. And then these photos were posted to many online sites. And from there, the Disney internet had an absolute field day. Many people compared the animatronic to Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy. And from those close-up photos, I will say this didn't seem that far off to me. Other people compared him to Floyd the Barber from the 1960s TV series The Andy Griffith Show. And then those same close-up photos were picked up by larger sites, including local TV news, newspapers, and general news sites. And if you just looked at these photos, I think it would be easy to say that Walt's granddaughter's concerns were realized. These photos did not look like a realistic Walt Disney. They looked, to use her phrase, like a robot. And I don't mean to minimize her concerns. They are valid. But let me break down this a little bit more. Again, clearly some things are off in the figure's presentation, particularly in the face. The body movements, however, are far more fluid, nuanced, and believable. And I have seen that criticism of one held pose of the Walt animatronic in which he has his left elbow out. It does look a little awkward, but just go back and look at Walt's filmed intros to his weekly show. That elbow out pose was a familiar one for him, especially in the early years. And back then, I'm guessing people coached him towards poses that were more natural. That is, the awkwardness of that elbow out pose is the exact same awkwardness of Walt's actual elbow out pose. Walt was a film producer and visionary, not necessarily a stage actor. But to get back to the main line of thought here, no realistic human animatronic looks particularly good in a still photo, especially a close-up of the face. As humans, we are all biologically wired and socially trained to focus in on the faces of those around us, particularly that area from the eyes down to the mouth. This is a key human skill that we use to understand if we're safe or being threatened, to understand if people are engaged with us or engaged with something else. From an evolutionary standpoint, we look at people's faces to gauge our level of safety. Without even consciously processing these things, we are aware of nuanced meaning in facial expressions in those around us. Animatronics or even sculpture simply can't compare to the rich range of meaning expressed in an actual human face, at least not yet. Earlier in today's episode, I talked about the evolution of Disney animation. Disney animation began with the presentation of full figures and often exaggerated bodily gestures to communicate intent and emotion. The Disney animators in general didn't yet have the skills to create a series of drawings that communicated nuanced emotion through the presentation and movement of facial features. In terms of animatronics today, I don't think this is necessarily an artistic hurdle so much as a technological hurdle. Garner Holt, who specializes in animatronic figures, has some very complex animatronic head models that communicate emotion. But the emotion that they communicate slants more towards the exaggerated: fear, surprise, shock, deep joy, and so on. Everyday emotion, which is communicated with small movements, is far more difficult to arrange into an animatronic figure. That will come someday, but in terms of technology, we just aren't there yet. Also, animatronics don't always look their best in still photos. This is also true in animation. If you flip through a series of drawings for an animated scene, figures do look good in held poses, that is, poses where the figure is stationary on the screen for more than a single beat. But they don't always look their best in a single drawing mid-movement. And this is also true for animatronics. They look best when they're posed, not so much when they're shifting from pose to the next pose. So here's where I think things went really wrong. The initial plan, I think, should have been to present the Walt figure to the public with both distance and motion. ideally a short 30-second clip of the animatronic moving with the footage taken from around the middle of the theater. That might have shown the figure as more believable. Also, have the lighting in the video match the theatrical lighting without it being tweaked to give more illumination to shadowed areas. And then have this as the only public image of the figure for a week or maybe two, and people would have gotten used to it. But instead, the company had a preview, largely attended again by bloggers and influencers, some of whom were very skilled with modern mirrorless cameras and low-light lenses. Then on social media, these close-ups of the Walt animatronic face, likely with the ISO dialed up to let in more light, became the first touch point for most of the public to see this new Walt animatronic. And those images got shared from site to site to site. And admittedly, many of those images aren't particularly flattering, and I think there might have been an incentive for some of the bloggers to find the least flattering images to post, as that would create more conversation. And before I finish this up, I think I should also contextualize the audio a bit, because it sounds different than other audio for similar audio animatronic presentations. Here in 2025, we're used to experiencing audio animatronics accompanied by dialogue that was recorded in pristine studio environments, which creates an immediacy in the presentation of the spoken voice. A voice actor's mouth is typically very close to the mic, with the environment controlled to optimally capture audio so that it sounds intimate. There's simply no audio like this for Walt. Most of the audio for this show comes from a 1963 television interview conducted by Fletcher Markle, which was done in a reasonably open space with the mics at a distance from the speakers. So if you're accustomed, let's say, to the commanding and sonorous tones of Abe Lincoln, the audio presentation here is going to be slightly different. The audio quality has been improved and adjusted, but it still has the flavors of a mid-20th century TV interview. But even with those limitations, one of the fabulous elements of the presentation is, I think, Walt's voice, underscored with kindness, a muted enthusiasm, and a sense of infectious optimism. Having that voice inside the park is a fabulous way to introduce younger visitors to who Walt was in his lifetime. All that aside, I've seen the show now multiple times from various places inside the Opera House Theater. Again, I can see that the presentation is not the same as seeing a real person. I can confirm that the facial structure is a little too wide, a little too heavy, a little too square in the chin. Like other animatronics, the Walt figure here gestures a little more than do real people, including Walt himself. But with the lighting and the distance in the theater itself, all of these limitations are softened. The show is not perfect. There were moments where I was very conscious that I was watching an animatronic, but there were brief moments where there was a small, fleeting sense that this was, in fact, a presentation of who Walt was, when he leans against the desk, when he shifts the weight of his body from one side to the other, the way his right hand turns small, thoughtful circles, how he shifts that hand back and forth as though considering his words, or how he turns his palms face up, emphasizing a question. Even that left elbow out, that was Walt. That was how he sometimes stood. There are some well-studied pieces of Walt in this presentation, which are better expressed in the movement of his body and in his hands than in the presentation of his face. Overall, there's an articulation here of individual fingers that surpasses what I've seen in any other animatronic. Disney's Lincoln figure over the years has gone through various iterations, and so maybe as technology improves, there will be another version of the Walt figure someday with more nuanced control of small facial expressions, as it was the little movements here that best defined his personality. Twice when I saw the show, when speaking to people who sat next to me once it was over, They both said that looked far better than what I saw online. But beyond all this, here's one more thing I like about this attraction. Not only is this a new attraction with absolutely no film-related IP, but it's also an attraction that points to the rich history of the company and to who Walt was. And so even if there are some technological or perhaps craft limitations here, I was still pretty happy to sit through the show multiple times and to see the modern Disney company celebrating all of the rich areas from its early decades. I'll be back next week with a new episode. The plan right now, at least, is to talk about the new entertainment and revised attraction opening later this week at Disney World. Specifically, Starlight, the first nighttime parade in the Magic Kingdom in nearly a decade, and also the revisions to Test Track. There's also a couple of other Florida-related stories that I hope to get to next week as well. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney Studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.